Now we're going to move to something that a lot of people love, you know, pinturas de casta, or cast paintings, casta paintings, or different words, are really the work that opened an interest into the 18th century. They're a genre of painting that seemed to be particular to the 18th century in New Spain. Okay, there are certain kinds of paintings that depict race in Peru, but they're very different from the cast paintings. So the cast paintings seem to be very unique to New Spain, and specifically to the area around, of course, Mexico City. And what pinturas de casta are, this is the one in the image set. This has been attributed to Juan Rodriguez Juarez. He was a painter working in the early 18th century, and he seems to be the first colonial painter that is working with the new Bourbon viceregal court. Okay, the Bourbons come into the throne in 1700, after the War of Succession, 1700, 1715, and Juan Rodriguez Juarez becomes a painter for the Bourbon viceregal court. So he's probably like the first Bourbon colonial painter who works for the court, the viceregal court in Mexico City. And like many artists of his time, I mean, he did portraits. There are a lot of portraits. He did religious images. He did, in the 18th century, all the major artists do cast paintings at one time or another. You know, so this is one image of a series of cast paintings that were produced, or we think are produced by Rodriguez Juarez. It makes sense, around 1715. And what we're looking at here, again, we have text to clarify in case you don't know what you're looking at. We have, it says, of a Spaniard and an Indian produces mestizo. So you have the Spanish man. He's either Creole, either American born or from Spain. We can't tell. He's just called Spanish. He could have been an American Creole. Then we have an Indian woman who's dressed very well. You know, she's dressed in indigenous style, but clearly well off. And their two mestizo children. Okay, and it's like a family scene. And one of the questions we have to ask is if they're interested in depictions of racial types, why not just have like the mulatto and the mestizo? Why bring the father and the mother into it? I'm going to explain why. Cast paintings take one of two forms. Oh, here are just two others. They're part of a series. This one is of Spaniard and mestizo, produced castizo. Of Spaniard and a black woman, they produce mulatto. Just examples from this one series. Here is a self-portrait of Juan Rodriguez Juarez, one of the few self-portraits we have. I think there are only 2 or 3 that I know of. This is one of them from around 1710, I'm guessing, on canvas. And then to the right is one of the individuals who was like a patron. He's the viceroy, the first Bourbon viceroy, the Duke of Linares. That he painted that portrait. And you can tell the style is the French influence with the wig and the velvet waistcoat, the gauntlets, the gloves, typical of colonial portraiture with the drape element, the crest, writing in a cartouche that it's almost like a CV. It identifies who it is, any major accomplishments. Then there's always some kind of table with objects on it that refer back to the individual's profession or status. This is the typical language. It's full length, quarter turn, sumptuous dress, drape element, objects, cartouche, family crest. We're going to see this language repeatedly in colonial portraiture or secular colonial portraiture. So cast paintings take one of two forms. The whole issue of castas is really interesting because, you know, the first artist we think produced an early version of this. I don't have images of his work. His last name was Arellano. Very, very early. There's at least one painting I've seen known to be by him that seems to depict a mestiza. Okay? But it's very, very different. It's Juan Rodriguez Juarez who produces the type of cast painting that becomes a model. That is where you have a family group. But and the casts reflect the racial mixing in Noble Hispanic society. And you start with 3 parent groups. There's the white Spaniard, typically male, the Indian woman, and the black. Okay? And you always start, and it's in a series of 16 vignettes. The thing is that there are numerous names, there are numerous categories of castas, but there are as many as there are over 60 in some of the more populated areas, and as few as 4 or 6 out in the countryside. You know, but in terms of the paintings itself, they get sort of codified into 16. So you have either all 16 on one canvas like this, like a taxonomic chart. Here we have to think about like Enlightenment ideas and kind of pseudo-scientific interest in identifying and organizing and taxonomies, you know, So it's like a taxonomic chart. There are 4 registers with 4 vignettes running across. Or if you have the money and the space, you can commission to have a series of cast paintings where each of the vignettes becomes an individual canvas. Okay, those are the 2 versions, either all on one canvas, like a taxonomic chart, or in a series of individual canvases that depict the racial mixing. It always starts with the white Spanish man mixing with the Indian woman, producing a mestizo. And what's really interesting, if you look at the first couple of vignettes, that embedded in these paintings, there's a suggestion that you can mix with natives. You can be a Spaniard, mix with native, but your descendants could go back to being Spanish. So it's not all lost if you mix with a native. So the first image, of course, is the Spaniard with an Indian producing a mestizo. Then that product is then mixing back with the Spaniard in the next vignette, producing what's called a castizo, who's lighter. And then the castizo then shows up in the next vignette, mixing with the Spaniard, producing a Spaniard. And to me, that's a very interesting dynamic in the 18th century, because in the 18th century, when we start to see sort of this interest in independence, the Creoles, the upper class aristocratic Hispanics, the American-born Hispanics, the Creoles, one of the arguments they seem to present to justify sort of their valid claim to self-sovereignty is that even though they're white, that they're all mestizo, because their ancestors mixed with Indians. And not just any Indians, they mixed with upper class Aztec. Okay? So they have Indian blood in them, which makes them mestizo, which gives them a claim to the land. Okay? So when you think about that kind of argument that we see in the 18th century, then you look at the first couple of vignettes, it seems to kind of illustrate how that happens. Is you can mix with the native, but if your descendants keep mixing back with Spaniards, you can reach back Spanish status. Okay? It's an interesting kind of political thing there.
So the castizo, what is that?
That's a mixture of mestizo and Spanish.
Okay, so
yeah.
It's kind of like on your way back.
Yes, yeah. The castizo's lighter than the mestizo. Then when the castizo mixes with the Spaniard, they produce a Spanish again. But once you have black, you can't go back. You know, once the black gets mixed in, there's no way you can go back to being Spanish. The Bourbons actually passed policies to prevent racial mixing with blacks. There was like a really strong kind of racist element to the Bourbons where they actually implemented policies to prevent certain kinds of miscegenation. So mixing with the black is a no-no. And what you see in the rest of the casts are all the different mixtures from that point forward. And the more mixed you become, the darker skinned. And it's not just about phenotype. There's an element here of, or elements that suggest profession or trade, class, but also character. In many cases, the cast paintings are very stereotypical and offensive. You know, where like black women are depicted as sexual or as violent and aggressive, or the more mixed you are, the poorer you are, the more violently inherent you are, criminal, okay? And to me, a lot of people misread these. This does not give us a window into what the population in Mexico City would look like. This kind of gives us sort of an interpretation of, or an ideology. It's a representation of an ideology of difference. The majority of whites, the light-skinned Hispanics, were poor. The majority of them were poor, but you don't see any light-skinned people at the bottom. You know, the light-skinned people are towards the top. And the idea here, kind of reflecting what was an obsession for the Spanish, limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, was an obsession for the Spanish. And it still is today in Latin America. Latin America is still very colonial in these kinds of hierarchies. Limpieza de sangre, if you look at any elite classes in Latin America, they're all European looking. They're very white. You just look at telenovelas. It's all the white Mexicans. You know, limpieza de sangre means purity of blood. And this is something that can be traced back to the 15th century in Spain when the Muslims were expelled and the Jews were forcibly converted. This obsession with demonstrating that you're not tainted by Muslim or African or Jewish blood becomes a thing that gets incorporated into colonial policy. In order to serve as a colonial official, you have to demonstrate old Christian stock and purity of blood. That is brought to the Americas, where now the Indians and the blacks and the Asians are implicated. So limpieza de sangre is kind of this obsession. And in the 18th century, mixing with black, this dilution was believed to not only change you racially or phenotypically, but also affect or degrade the quality of your character. Okay, so what we see here is, this is an earlier one. They look like almost like mannequins in a natural history museum. You know, they're just wearing the outfits, standing in blank backgrounds, but eventually there's backgrounds like this one. They're shopping. They're clearly at a market. They're shopping for textiles. She's dressed very nicely. Okay, let's look at some others. The one on the left, we know this is not about a race as we understand it, because the albino is incorporated. We know that's not a race. It's really interesting about the albino. She was sort of a question mark and a threat, because she looks white, but she might be mixed. You just can't tell because she's albino. So in the cast paintings, when the albino's married to the Spaniard, or we don't know if they're married, but she's with the Spaniard, she always produces a black child. Torna atrás, some of these names are crazy, means turn backward, to look backward, or to go backward. Okay? So when the albino always, in the cast paintings, we know this genetically is improbable, but at least in the language of cast paintings, it's codified, where the albino woman always has a black child. You know, and this becomes sort of an obsession. I always tell my classes about when I was really little in San Antonio. My mom's from Mexico. We would go watch Mexican movies from the Golden Age, the 40s and 50s. There was a theater downtown. And in the 60s, when I was really little, we would go downtown to see the movies. And there was a group of movies made like in the 40s and 50s that kind of focused on this kind of obsession with race. This is in the 20th century. There's one movie called Angelitos Negros, Little Black Angels. And it's about this like upper-class Mexico City girl. She's light-skinned, of course, wealthy, the toast of the town. She's engaged to marry this wealthy young man from a well-positioned family, again, light-skinned, Mexico City. Everybody loves them. They have their friends. She was raised by her black nanny and her father. Her mother died in childbirth, so the nanny raised her. Well, they get married. She gets pregnant. Everyone's happy. And she gives birth to a black baby. And the husband leaves her, and their friends stop talking to her, and she rejects the baby. The nanny takes the baby. It's a Mexican movie, so it has a moral. You know, she eventually turns out that her mother's actually the black nanny, that her father had an affair with a black servant, which is common in the colonial period. White men were like getting around. And so it turns out her father had an affair with the black nanny, and her mother had committed suicide. She hadn't died in childbirth. She was raised by her mother, the black nanny. So by the end of the movie, she comes around, the black nanny's dying, she accepts her baby and accepts the black nanny as her mother, and everybody's happy. You know, has like a good moral conclusion. But to me, it's just astounding, you know, yeah, that we look at this from the colonial period, and in Mexico, it's still a thing.
Well, my question was too, were the people living, because we know that the people buying these were in Spain, right, to understand?
Well, it appears that the first cast paintings were commissioned to be taken back, just like the manuscripts much earlier, to take back to Spain so they can see American types.
Right.
Okay.
So were those living there, did they know I am a castiza or I'm a mestiza? Would they know those things, and would that be an issue in marrying? Like, were they as obsessed with it as maybe Spaniards?
Well, I mean, there's been a suggestion that the castas didn't really exist because the racial mixing is so fluid. But what we do find, there's a scholar, R. Douglas Cope, who went through archives looking primarily 16th, 17th century. And what he identified was that people were illiterate. Okay, marriage, most people didn't marry. Marriage was something conducted only by the upper class. There's even there's some cases where the common population ridicule marriage as a Spanish kind of practice. You know, people would just shack up, have kids, break up. You know, it was very fluid, unstable. We don't see marriage promoted until this period, the 18th century, which is one of the reasons I think we have this emphasis on family. But before this, people didn't marry. The majority of people didn't marry. But when a child is born, they would still get it baptized and registered. And he looked at all these archives, and what he finds is because most people were illiterate, they couldn't read, and most of them, because of the nature of instability in the home, they didn't know their parents' names. They didn't know their own last names. So the church official would see a man and a woman bringing their child to be baptized, and he would look at them, and they don't know their last names, so he would look at her. Her name's Juana, and he'd be like, you look like you're part black. So he'd just write Juana la Mulata. That's her name in the record. They'd be identified by the phenotype. And he would look at the man, Pedro, he looks Indian, Pedro el Indio. Their kid clearly is a mixture, so, you know, Pedro el Lobo, whatever the caste name is. And that's how they're recorded in the documents. They don't know their names, so the castes would surface as identifiers in legal.
Maybe not that they would self-identify.
Yeah.
But in these
Yeah.
records.
Right. Yeah. You know, and the things that what we understand as race, of course, it's a social construction, but it's very slippery and unstable because race exists on multiple levels. On one hand, you have phenotype, okay, and the way you look and how other people see you. But you can also, during the colonial period, it was possible to change your racial status if you paid for it. It's called gracias al sacar. Yeah. You don't know me. So these petitions were called gracias al sacar, thanks for taking me out. And you could pay to have your racial status changed. You know, so there are cases like where natives or mestizos become wealthy. They become affluent and then they pay to change their racial status legally. I even came across a suggestion that there might even been like a white who changed their status down to Indian because natives were exempt from paying tax. These are artists. And there's at least one case I remember coming across where a white Creole changed his status to Indian to kind of avoid having to pay tax on what he was making.
Oh, so you could pay down.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So there's like, and so you have race, you know, visually. There's the phenotype. There's legally. There's also the nicknames. People call each other by nicknames. You know, even my family, one of my cousins looked Asian. We called him Chino, Chinese. You know, it still survives today. The use of, and I think the cast paintings must have been based on these earlier nomenclatures that predate the images. When the first artist was asked, produce an image of types, well, he's never seen this before. What do you think he's basing it on? Or he's basing it on the different categories, which survive in social practice through nicknames, which survive legally in the form of documents, you know, in addition to whatever you think someone looks like. I mean, so it's this very kind of complicated thing that gets negotiated in a number of ways. So a lot of people don't know how to read colonial documents. And this is an issue I have with, you know, especially in people in New Mexico. I found this to be true in some cases. When they see the word Espanol, they automatically think they're from Spain. That's not necessarily the case. They could have been American born. And they might not even be Spanish. They could be mestizo. There's no way of really knowing sort of racial makeup. So race is kind of the slippery thing. But what happens here is that some scholars have suggested, like Ilona Katsu, who's written a lot about this, is that this appears to be an attempt to kind of control the racial mixing that was really out of control. It was the Bourbons were trying to control it and stop it, but people were doing it. And the cast paintings, according to some, it seems to be like an attempt to kind of like codify and control, you know, this type of mixing. And then, I don't know, that's just it. That's just it.
Are there any reverse ones where it shows Indian man?
There's one, yeah. It becomes political in the late 18th century, but there's one particular painting that, it's not a cast painting. It has two rows of casts, landscapes, a still life at the bottom, and the Virgen de Guadalupe. It's all about an American experience. It's clearly a political painting to me. And that cast painting is the only one I've seen where it's an Indian man with a white woman, which would have been a no-no. You know, white women's bodies were controlled, especially elites, because white skin is important. You wanted to marry into the right families to consolidate wealth and power, and you wanted to have white babies, okay? So white women, especially elite white women, their movements were very controlled. And their lives were determined by the men in their lives. First their father, then their husband, maybe their brothers if they weren't married yet, later maybe their sons. You know, because the fear was that she would get involved with someone from the lower class or non-white, and then mix. Okay, that was always like an obsession. It was an obsession. So elite white women were very controlled. So that cast painting that has all these references to America, like local fruits in the still life, the cast process, landscapes or images of areas in and around Mexico City, and then the Virgen de Guadalupe on top of it all. I mean, clearly it's some kind of commentary on American identity and experience, but the very first vignette switches the typical format. It has an Indian male with a white woman, which would have been really like scandalous. It's a painting by this less known artist named Luis de Mena. I always show that in my classes. But in any case, just examples, and in terms of social rank, profession or trade, and then character, these are just examples. The lighter-skinned individuals don't work. They're like in these very comfortable settings. Here you have the father playing the violin, teaching his son the violin. They're dressed nicely. You know, they're very comfortable. It's leisurely activity. The darker people are out on the street selling food or cigarettes or whatnot. They're working. Okay, so there's that kind of association of skin color with trade, profession, and also intelligence, skill, quality, character. And some of these have been compared, for example, to these Rococo types of genre scenes, like a Fragonard's Le Roux Ménage, The Happy Marriage, Family, 1778-80. And I think that there is an association to be made there, this kind of representation of a family, either at leisure, at play, or at work. But there's some local elements that are also important to understand. This is Bartolomé Murillo, who is a Spanish painter from Seville, the Holy Family in the Carpenter's Workshop. Again, Joseph, Mary, and Christ. This becomes a model for the ideal Christian family. The ideal Christian family, the good colonial subject, the marriage is stable, everyone is trained, everyone is working. You know, the Bourbons open schools to train not just men, but women and children in different industries. They push marriage to stabilize the family unit, to make census recording more accurate. So everything they do is done to increase economic productivity. Stabilizing the marriage, training everybody, putting everyone to work, increases productivity. And you can keep track of them through the census because they're marrying now, so there's documents now that help you identify the population. And I think all of these images kind of respond to this larger political context. You have the focus on families and working in cast paintings, and then you have these kinds of images also circulating, the ideal, I mean, the prototype of the Christian family, the Holy Family in the Workshop. I mean, I think it's pretty clear what the agenda is. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And because of the discussion of the cast paintings, I'm now noticing that Joseph is browner, and so is John the Baptist.
Mm.
And the Virgin and the Christ Child are the whiter skin.
Yeah.
You know, and it's interesting to, I mean, Murillo wouldn't have been thinking about elevating.
Right,
And he
right.
would have been.
No,
But
no,
it's just
no.
the way that they
Yeah.
paint.
Yeah. You know, and we have colonial versions of this subject, you know, disseminated, you know. So what I'm saying is all these things intersect and kind of reflect its period. This would not have happened in the Habsburg period. It's clearly a Bourbon period kind of phenomenon. Yeah. Right. Right. Exactly. And the Bourbons also saw the church as competition. You know, the Habsburgs, you know, worked very closely with the church. But the Bourbons come in, they believe, you know, they're kind of separating church and state, and they want the church's wealth. And they start stripping the church of its privileges and power. Before, education fell in the realm of the church. They were all religious professors and scholars. Marriage was a sacrament. The church promoted that. But in the 18th century, the Bourbon take that over. They take over education. It becomes secularized. They're the ones who start promoting marriage. So they start stripping the church of its privileges and its power, and also its properties at some point. You know, I mean, Spain's sinking. You know, it's in economically dire straits, and everything the Bourbons do, as I mentioned, through increased productivity, increased taxation, introducing new engineering technologies to increase mining production, is to support Spain, which is sinking. You know, Spain's done, very clearly. You know, everything the Bourbons do is to try to reinforce Spain's standing, but it just seems like there's no way around the fact that Spain is done. And in short, just a few years after this, then Spain's empire starts to fall apart.